Okay, cool. What time is this session over? Oh, 10? Okay, we got 45 minutes. Sweet. I'm going to start there with what you said. I used to write. I titled this Creative Writing as a Spiritual Discipline because I think a lot of people, could we maybe turn this down a little bit? I'm very loud to myself. A lot of people, I think, have a wrong view of creativity, not just creative writing, but creativity in general, that causes us to neglect it. And that view being, creativity is often seen as this self-indulgent thing, right? It's seen as a hobby, something you do in your spare time, something you enjoy, but it's really just for yourself. So when life gets busy, when you have more responsibilities or job or school, you get married or you have kids and you're trying to, you feel like you don't have any time and you start cutting out what is unnecessary, usually creativity is one of the first things to go. I find people, I meet particularly adults, but even folks in college all the time that say, I used to write poetry, I used to play guitar, I used to paint, but, life happened. And so they cut it. They dropped it. They didn't have time for it. I understand that, but when it comes to the busyness of life, when it comes to the stress of life, I tell people all the time, creativity should be one of the last things to go. You're so stressed out, and playing guitar was the only time where you felt at peace. Painting was the only time that you felt like yourself. Why would you cut that? If you're stressed, you need to be playing guitar more than ever. You need to be writing poetry more than ever, right? And so that's why I said creative writing as a spiritual discipline, to reframe it from this selfish, self-indulgent thing to a spiritual discipline. Some might say, but you understand, if instead of creative writing, poetry, painting, singing, if instead you said prayer, you wouldn't be as comfortable saying, well, I used to pray, but life got busy, and I got kids and a job and responsibilities, and I just don't have time for it anymore. You understand? No, that's not okay. Now, you might do that. You might neglect prayer, but you realize that's a problem. And so I say creativity is one of those things that keeps us holistically, spiritually, emotionally. It keeps us healthy. It's a spiritual discipline like prayer, like reading the Bible, like community and fellowship. You need those things. It's not things that you just neglect because you get too busy. But that's what we do with creativity. So I think one of the most important things you could do is to realize that this is not a selfish thing. This is a thing that even if you don't necessarily share your art or share your poetry, even if you just do it in private and write for yourself, it allows you to process your thoughts. It allows you to communicate with God, to de-stress. And it's something that you don't have to feel like you're obligated to neglect because of your other responsibilities. Actually, if you continue it, it will help you be more effective in all the other things that you do have to do. Because you have an outlet to let things out in the process and to de-stress. So that's that's kind of where the title comes from. I say this, I understand not everyone here is necessarily a poet or a creative writer, but I say creative writing is like exercise. And what I mean by that is we understand with exercise, some people are naturally athletically gifted. Some people go on a run for fun, which I don't understand. That's an oxymoron. When I go for a jog, my lungs are burning. I feel like I'm going to die, right? When I go to the gym, you lift weights, and some like, yeah, feel the burn. And I'm like, my arms are going to fall off, right? But we understand with exercise, whether you enjoy it or not, whether you feel like you are a natural athlete or not, if you discipline yourself to engage in exercise, you will benefit from it, whether you like it or not, whether you think that you're good at it or not. And that's what I mean when I say creative writing is a spiritual discipline. Some of you are natural writers. Some of you enjoy writing. Some of you, it is the bane of your existence. Oh, I hate it. But if you discipline yourself to do it, you will benefit from it, even if it's a painful process. Why is that? Well, there's a quote from a professor of mine in college named Dr. Michael McDuffie, and he said this: "We write to have that existential sense of encounter, even if the encounter of the other is ourselves." This is a big philosophical sounding sentence, but we're going to focus on two words: existential and encounter. We write to have that existential sense. Now, existentialism, when it comes to philosophy, can mean a lot of things, but we're going to focus on the root word, exist. We write to have that sense of existence. What does it mean to exist? This water bottle exists, but it doesn't exist in the same way that I exist. It's different. Well, it's not alive. Yeah, well, trees are alive, but trees also don't exist in the same way I exist. They don't like think and feel, have community. Okay, well, lions are alive, and they have communities and they have brains, but they still don't exist in the same way that we exist. What's the difference? Well, lions do not write poems to other lions they have crushes on, right? Lions do not come into classrooms and learn about the history of generations of lions that came before them so they might not repeat their mistakes, right? Writing gives us a sense of existence that is greater than just us, right? Because of writing, because of poetry and songs and books and novels and history textbooks, when we're born into this world, we realize we are connected to something bigger than us. We realize that we exist in a community of humanity and generations of. We write to have that existential sense, to be more aware of the world we live in and the community and the history of human beings, right? And we write for future generations, right? We write so our children and grandchildren can know what came before them and have a better sense of self because of it. When we understand our history, when we understand the poetry and the art and the song of our context, we understand ourselves better. So we write to have that existential sense of encounter. Now, what does it mean to encounter? Well, two separate beings that exist cross paths. What's your name? Leanna, Micah. So before today, I existed, Leanna existed, but we had not encountered. Now that we're having an encounter, I can learn about her, she can learn about me. Even without her telling me anything, I can make observations about her because I can look and she can look at me, and then we can talk and we can exchange information, and I can observe the way she responds to things and her facial expressions, and I can get a sense of her personality. And so because we are encountering, I'm growing and getting a deeper understanding of who she is. So, makes sense. We write to have that existential sense of encounter, but the second half gets tricky. Even if the encounter of the other is ourselves. See, how do you encounter yourself when there's only one of you? Because me and Leanna can sit across a table at a coffee shop and have a conversation, but I can't sit down and have a conversation with myself. How do you do that? Well, that's the question of human existence. We all want to encounter ourselves in one way or another. And we go to counselors, and we go to spiritual ceremonies, and we listen to wise teachers, and we read books, and we do all type of things. We watch Oprah and Dr. Phil to try to get a sense of ourselves, and some of those things are helpful. But for me, writing, as my professor was saying, we write to have that existential sense of encounter, even if the encounter of the other is ourselves. One of the reasons writing is so healthy for you is because it helps you encounter yourself, right? It doesn't have to be you finding your journal from middle school. It can be you reading your journal entry from last week and being surprised at what you see. Oh my gosh. Is that what I said about that person I love? Is that how I really feel? See, all the time we have thoughts and emotions, and we get in arguments, and we say a bunch of stuff, and no one writes it down, and it just disappears into whatever. But I have learned so much about myself by sitting and reading my own poems and reading my own writings from it doesn't have to be super long time ago. It allows you kind of to sit and wrestle with the fact that whatever is on that page came out of your mind and heart, and it's in your handwriting, in your notebook. Now, what are you going to do with that, right? It helps you encounter yourself. The other reason why writing is, like exercise, good for you whether you like it or not. It helps you encounter yourself, but also it helps you encounter others and God. Others in the sense of, you ever listen to a song by an artist you have never met, and you're like, how did they know? They're reading my mind. Like, I should have wrote this. They don't know you. But that's the beautiful thing about writing. All of us, we're all different. We have different backgrounds and different stories and different cultures. But we all, if you're a human being, we have all experienced the range of human emotion. We have all felt alone and excited and confused and anxious and blah, 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 blah. So yes, even though you've never sat down and had a conversation with her, Taylor Swift wrote your whole life. You know what I'm saying? It just happens, right? It's just like, how is this possible? But the beautiful thing, and that's what drew me to writing. I got invited to an open mic when I was in college. It was the summer before my junior year. And I just sat in a room. I'd never written a spoken word poem in my life before. And poet after poet got on stage. And I was like, how did they know? How did they know? And it was so helpful for me to realize, man, I am not as alone as I thought I was. All of these things I was embarrassed about that I thought if I told anyone, they would look at me different, or I'd be an outcast. And all of a sudden I'm sitting in a room full of strangers feeling so connected because people are just taking their mask off and saying, hey, this is what it is. So writing for yourself is good, but I strongly encourage people to share their writing too, because you realize you're not as alone as you thought you were. And again, having that community, being aware that you're not the only person in the world who's felt that way, can push you towards processes of healing. So those are the main reasons. Writing is like exercise. It's good for you whether you like it or not, because it connects you to yourself, it connects you to others, and lastly, and most importantly, it connects you to God. How does it connect you to God? Well, first of all, when we read Scripture, we see how important poetry and story and creative writing is to the purposes of God and in the lives of the people of God. Art, creative writing, is essential to understanding God and living out the gospel. See, Jesus had great theology, and he easily could have constantly spewed facts about himself to reveal who he was. But instead, he chose to use creative words, parable, stories, metaphors, to reveal himself. See, Jesus could have came to earth and said, I am Jesus Christ, the second person of the triune God, Father, Son, and Spirit, the incarnate Lord in the flesh, hypostatic union, fully God, fully man, immaculate conception. He could have used all these theological terms, but that's not what he did. Jesus came to earth, and you know what he said? He said, I am the good shepherd. I am the door. I am the light of the world. I am the vine, and you are the branches. You are the salt of the earth. You are the workers in the field, and the field is ripe for harvest. What are all those? Metaphors. They're metaphors. Jesus was constantly employing poetic language to explain who he was. Not necessarily dry, systematic theology. Now, it was theology, but it was in the context of creative, poetic image communication. They're metaphors. They're more than just information and facts. They are creative, poetic ways of communicating deep theological truths. And again, when Christ was asked, who is your neighbor? He could have given a factual, theologically sound answer about how all humans are created in the image of God and so on, but he didn't. Instead, he told a story, a short story. Oh, you're supposed to love your neighbor. Well, who's your neighbor? Who's your neighbor, Jesus? What is our, spiritual, theological responsibility? To love our neighbor. I mean, well, who's your neighbor? He says, oh, you want to know who your neighbor is? Let me tell you a story. There was a man traveling from Jerusalem to Jericho, and he got beat up and left for dead. And a holy man, a priest, passed him. And then a Levite of the priestly tribe also passed him. And then a Samaritan, his ethnic enemy, people that there's racial tension and prejudice towards. He stopped, the Samaritan of all people stopped and saw this Jew. And he helped him out. He nursed him back to health. Now you tell me, who's his neighbor? See, Jesus was asked a deep theological question and didn't say, in Isaiah chapter 14, verse 32. He says, let me tell you a story. But this is the thing. The story was not the introduction to the sermon. The story was the sermon. Right? That was it. The end. See, I could go on and on with examples, not just in the life of Christ, but all throughout Scripture. Most people know that the Psalms and Proverbs and Song of Solomon are poetic in nature, but far beyond that, so many of the Old Testament prophets wrote rebuke, praise, encouragement in the form of poetry, song, creative writing, storytelling. And again, these works of art do not merely make way for the deep spiritual lessons, but they are themselves hearty spiritual substance. That being said, I want to make a brief comment on the church's relationship to art. Because Jesus did not use art in the way that our churches often do. And that is a bait on the hook, right? An introduction to the sermon. Jesus didn't use it like that. See, art should not be the bait on the hook. It should not be merely what we use to attract the youth. Art is not the cherry on top. It is not the appetizer or the dessert to the main dish, being the lecture or the sermon or the Bible study. No, that view of art is what leads to the type of Christian culture art that makes us all cringe. Though art can and should be used to teach, if we approach it primarily as a bait on a hook or a teaching tool, we disrespect the art form, and the artwork itself becomes manipulative. Instead of spiritually potent expressions of divine truth revealed to us, we write sermons that rhyme and call them poems or songs, forcefully stuffing the lyrics with our theology. Instead of vulnerable, provocative narratives inspired by the reality of our lives and experiences with God, we write predictable, unlikely stories with not so hidden Christian agendas. We make Christian propaganda and call it art. If you are a Christian engaging in creative expression, you do not have to force your theology. But you must find the courage to speak honestly about life as a person of faith, and the theology will be present. Example, David. See, David had no hidden agenda. David was not caught up in a sacred versus secular culture war. He was a poet who chronicled his life in poetry and song. He was a prophet who sinned greatly against God. First, David coveted his neighbor's wife. Then, David committed adultery. Then, he committed murder to cover up the adultery. So when he writes in Psalm 32, "When I kept silent, my bones wasted away. Day and night the hand of God was heavy upon me. My strength was dried up as by the heat of summer. But then I acknowledged my sin to you, and I did not cover my iniquity. I said, I will confess my transgression to the Lord, and you forgave the iniquity of my sin. Blessed is the man whose sins are forgiven." See, David wasn't trying to prove nothing. He wasn't trying to convince nobody. He was just telling you what happened. That was just his story. He was courageous enough to write vulnerably of his experience, and it was potent, and it was beautiful, and it was theological, and we read it, and we say, oh, me too. Blessed is the man whose sins are forgiven. But let's wait for a second. Rewind. Imagine if this took place in our context of Christianity and Christian culture and Christian art in America. In America, Christian art, for the longest, the Christian radio station in California had a slogan, "It's safe for the whole family," right? And that's what we mean. When we say Christian art, what we usually mean is just PG, kid-friendly, family-friendly art, right? That's what we mean. No cuss words, nothing too risque. What was David writing about when he said, my bones, when I kept silent, my bones wasted away because I was hiding secret sin? He was writing about adultery and murder. Imagine, for a second, in our context, a Christian leader, a famous, world-renowned pastor or worship leader, cheats on his wife. Actually, I'm going to call it this, some might disagree, rapes another man's wife. Because Bathsheba did not have a choice when the king summoned her, right? So a Christian, prominent Christian leader rapes another man's wife and gets her pregnant. Is like, crap, I messed up. Let me cover this up by killing that man and marrying this woman and acting like this is legitimate. Then gets caught, goes to jail, is confronted about his sin, realizes it, and then writes a worship album or a book about the blessedness of the forgiveness of God. Blessed is the man whose sins are forgiven. And he tells in this book or in this album, he sings about his whole story. Who would be the first one to sign up to read that book or buy that book or support that book? Hey, this awesome album by, David so-and-so just came out. You should pick. No, right? What happens to Christian leaders in our context, to Christian artists who fall in that way? It's over. You're done. Your career is over. Right? No one has respect for you. But because it's in the Bible and it's a psalm and we don't think about the context, oh, well, it's Psalm 23. Blessed is the man whose sins are forgiven. It feels so good to be forgiven. No, this is a adulterous murder rapist who is saying, I felt like I was dying when I kept silent, when I had them skeletons in my closet, when I was sitting on secret sin, my bones wasted away like a hot, dry summer with no rain. But then I acknowledged my sin. Oh, let me tell you how amazing it is to be forgiven by God of such heinous acts. That is the type of poetry we need to be writing. But that's not Christian. You can't sing about that, mug. You can't be real about that in Christian art, right? But this is the type of spiritual disciplines. When I talk about creativity as a spiritual discipline, we need to go there. We don't need to just be writing pretty sounding stuff. So I'm going to skip this part because I talked about it last night of what should I write about, but just a quick review. Again, the story with Rainer Maria Reich in Rome. Okay, sounds good. I'm convinced creative writing is good for me. I just don't know where to start. It's everywhere. Hone in your observation skills. Go through life slower. Pay attention to the people and the things around you. Ask questions. Seek it out, and you will find more beauty. I will just read this part and not the story from Rome again. But one of the most important parts of being an artist and a Christian is honing your observation skills. As Rainer points out, we must not rely on vacations to Rome, the big fancy experiences in life that are expected to inspire us. But we observe everything in life. We see beauty everywhere if we go through life just a little bit slower. So many poems I've written arise from ordinary objects, activities, conversations, and experiences. Something that made me think, and I took the time to develop the thought. This concept has much spiritual significance because we do the same thing when it comes to God. We want God to take us to Rome. We want to be awed by the majestic. We seek the miraculous so much that we miss God's beauty and God's blessings and God's work ever present in our everyday lives. Jesus said in Matthew chapter 16, verse 4, a wicked and an adulterous generation looks for signs. Creative writing is a spiritual discipline. Discipline yourself to look for the beauty around you, not to wait for the sky to crack open, not to wait for the sea to part, or a miracle to happen, or somebody to prophesy or walk on water. A wicked and an adulterous generation sits around and waits. Well, God, you got to do something amazing for me to believe, or me to understand, or me to move, or me to take a step of faith in that direction. I'm not going until I see a miracle and I know for sure. No, walk by faith. Do something. Don't wait for a sign. Look closer. Find the beauty. Find God. Seek God. If you begin observing life consistently through creative writing, whether it be through your journal entries, short stories, poems, songs, lyrics, I guarantee you will find more beauty in it. You will see more God in it. Another question is, what makes something spiritually compelling, deep? How is it going to be wise, beautiful, or challenging if we're writing about everyday things, if we're writing about ordinary stuff? Again, I feel like there's an assumption here that when it comes to poetry, it has to be super deep and super metaphorical and really confusing, and like the deeper it is, then the better poetry it is. There's a poet named Gil Scott-Heron. You might have heard the phrase, "The revolution will not be televised." Well, that was Gil Scott-Heron. And he said this, he's an African-American poet, and he's talking about being in high school, and his teacher assigned a unit on poetry. And so she starts passing out these poems, and these particular poems were from the Shakespearean era. And so, they're reading, "Thou art a rose upon thine dawn of the wind in thine majestic flow," whatever. And the dude sitting next to him, the high school kid sitting next to him, he reads the poem in his head, and out loud he goes, "Hey, this must be deep." And what he was really saying is, I have no idea what this poem is saying, but since it sounds so fancy and so smart, it must be saying something important. And this is why many of us think we're not poets or not creative. We incorrectly associate complexity and ambiguity and floweriness with depth. Those things are not what make your poetry or your creative writing deep. It's not what makes it spiritual or profound or compelling. Over 80 years ago, a black baby girl was born in the segregated town of Prentiss, Mississippi. My grandma. She was one of 11 kids. She grew up farming vegetables and picking cotton, never graduated from high school because she had to drop out to take care of her younger siblings. An uneducated woman. When I sit down with my grandma Helen, she ain't got no big vocabulary, ain't nothing fancy about her speech, and yet she has just as much, if not more, wisdom and profundity to offer as any of my college professors with doctorates and multiple degrees. That woman is deep. The best way to be profound is to be honest. Compelling poetry is not about finding the perfect adjective to describe the noun or to find the perfect metaphor. It's about finding the courage to tell the simple truth. I'm not against style, but even when more poetic language is employed, we should remember that the purpose of metaphor and other poetic devices is to help people better understand what we're saying, not make it more confusing. So to use another biblical example, Psalm 23, a famous poem in the Bible. "The Lord is my shepherd, I shall not want. He makes me lie down in green pastures. He leads me beside still waters. He restores my soul." This is a metaphor, an extended metaphor throughout the whole poem. But this is the thing. The author is speaking to a context very familiar with sheep and shepherds. So the aim is, I need to describe my relationship with God. You know what? Let me use an image that my audience is familiar with so that it connects and it hits home. The Lord is my shepherd. You know how a shepherd, you know how shepherds protect the sheep, take care of the sheep, lead them to green pastures so they can eat, and then still waters so they can drink, and protects them and makes sure they're safe. That's what God is to me. The Lord is my shepherd. Right? So the point of the metaphor is not to flex the author's poetic superiority, is not to make it super metaphorical and ambiguous to make you go, "Hey, that must be deep." The point of the metaphor, the use of the metaphor, is to say, "Oh, I didn't quite understand what you were saying until you painted it in that picture, until you used that image, until you referenced something that I do understand and likened it to whatever you're trying to say. Now I get it," right? So The best poetry, the most compelling poetry is to be honest, and when you use poetic devices, you're trying to enhance comprehension and understanding, not make it more ambiguous. I think, personally, metaphor is often abused. All poetic devices are often abused, and I call it hiding behind the metaphor. As an artist, you get to a point where you want to say something, but you don't quite have the courage, so you hide behind the metaphor, and you make it ambiguous. Or you hide behind the abstract painting. And when someone says, hey, so what is this about? Oh, well, art is open to interpretation and, blah, blah, blah. Now, I know there's some degree of truth in that, right? But fact of the matter is, you were thinking something when you painted that. You were thinking something when you wrote that poem. It is an ambiguous image, and I'm not saying everything has to be straightforward, but I think sometimes people are just hiding. And that's not the purpose of metaphor. Don't worry about being deep. Observe everyday life. Use honest language, and employ poetic devices in a way that helps people connect to what you're creating. But I believe, and this will be in closing, and then we can have, I think, some time for question and answer. One of the biggest obstacles to people creating, one of the main reasons why they stop creating, besides getting busy and not looking at it like, the way we talked about earlier, like, hey, this is a healthy thing, it's not a selfish thing, it's not a self-indulgent thing. But the second, after that, because usually it's that, I stopped because I got too busy and they didn't value it for what it was as a spiritual discipline. But the second biggest obstacle to creating is that people just don't think what they're creating is good. And they get discouraged. I like poetry, but I want to write good poetry. And everything I'm writing sucks, so I'm going to stop. I want to share a story from a book called Art and Fear by David Bales and Ted Orland. And this book has been one of the most influential things on my creative process. Neither of these guys are people of faith particularly, but the creative process is such a spiritual thing that I read this book and it enhanced both my art and my faith so much. But in this book, Art and Fear, there's a story that goes like this. The ceramics teacher announced on opening day that he was dividing the class into two groups. All those on the left side of the studio he said, would be graded solely on the quantity of the work they produced, and all those on the right solely on its quality. His procedure was simple. On the final day of class, he would bring in bathroom scales and weigh the work of the quantity group. 50 pounds of pots rated an A, 40 pounds of B, and so on. Those being graded on quality, however, needed to produce only one pot, although a perfect one, in order to get an A. Well, came grading time, and a curious fact emerged. The works of highest quality were all produced by the group being graded on quantity. It seemed that while the quantity group was busily churning out piles of work and learning from their mistakes, the quality group had sat theorizing about perfection, and in the end had little more to show for their efforts than grandiose theories and a pile of dead clay. So this is the story. He says, okay, class split down the middle. Y'all being graded on quality, y'all being graded on quantity. You only got to do one pot the whole semester, but it got to be perfect to get an A. Your pots can suck. They could be hot boo-boo garbage pots. Doesn't matter. But you have to make 50 pounds of pots for an A, 40 pounds for a B, and so on. This is what happens. We so badly want our art to be good, to be perfect, that we sit around like this side of the class. They say, we only have to make one pot, but it's got to be perfect if we want an A. Oh, no. I have all these ideas. I have all these theories, and they start making a pot. Oh, nah. It's not good enough. Let me stop. I'll write a poem like a line in, and I'd throw it away. It doesn't even exist yet. Like, give it a chance, Like, you're killing this thing. It's not even, So, but that's what they did. They sat around theorizing about perfection, and they didn't do anything. Whereas the side of the class being graded on quantity, they realized, hey, you know what? The point is just to make a lot of pots. And they gave themselves the freedom to make bad art. And in the end, their art was better for it. Because they said, oh, the first 10, 15, 20 pounds sucks, but I'm trying to go to 50. So after making 15 pounds of pots, they're getting a little bit better. Now when they're on the 20 to 30 pounds, they're even more better. And now they're on 40 pounds, and by the time they reach 50 pounds of pots, their pots are looking beautiful. Now they got 30 pounds of trashy looking pots, but those last 10, 15 pounds are amazing, right? And so this is what I'm saying. And the whole point of the book is, the authors later say, what the artist needs to understand is that the purpose of the vast majority of your work is simply to teach you how to make this small portion of your work that will be good. To not be afraid of failure. Fact of the matter is, no matter how confident you are, no matter how good you think you are or how bad you think you are, every artist I know, every artist I respect, wildly successful or local small town artist, the people who have the best work always make a crap load of work. They always make the 50 pots. It's always how it goes. There's no other way around it. I saw this documentary on Picasso. And Picasso was one of those artists who got to be rich and famous before he died. Awesome. But when he died, they went into his mansion, and it was like, 3 or 4 stories. And on the first story in the basement, you went into his basement, and all along the walls, I saw it on the airplane. It's the documentary is out there. But it was like his big old basement. He had canvases stacked 5, 7 deep, but then there was like 20 rows of them. And there was just easels with canvases everywhere. And so for every $1 million Picasso hanging in a museum, there was 5 dusty, completed paintings that he thought were just not that good. And he was like, nah, these are just going to sit in the basement and collect dust. So he painted so many, but then there was just a few, right? I was watching Tupac, documentary on Tupac. Now, Tupac, everybody laughs. They say he's still alive. Part of the reason why they say that is because after he died, he released like 4 more albums, right? They're like, how does this fool keep making music from heaven or hell or wherever he is, right? But the thing is, you watch this documentary, and Tupac was saying, for an album, which is usually 10 to 12 songs, he would write and record 60 to 70 songs. And then put 12. He made 50 pots. And 40 of them were bad. But the album only had 10. Right? So you look and you're like, how the heck everything Tupac does is amazing? No, you just didn't see the rest. Now, some of those other ones might be good. But the point is, that has been my experience. I've become a much better writer than when I first started. But my percentages of writing good poems are not any higher. I'm just more comfortable writing bad stuff. Right? And so I'm like, no matter how good I get at writing, 8 out of every 10 poems I write are just going to be mediocre or bad. So if I let that discourage me, and I only write 10 poems, then I got 2 good ones. If I say, I already know that, that doesn't bother me. That's part of the process. I'm going to write 100 poems. Now I have 80 terrible poems, but I have 20 good ones instead of 2, right? It's just a numbers game. It's a discipline. It's like anything else. And again, I think shifting the idea of creativity being this kind of spacey thing that you sit around and wait for inspiration and lightning to strike, we need to shift into it being a discipline, creative writing as a spiritual discipline. You don't sit around and wait till you have an amazing idea and then create. You create out of discipline, out of habit, habitually, just like you pray, even when you don't feel like it. Just like you go to church, even when you don't feel like it. Just like any other discipline. When you're on a fast, a 30-day fast or whatever fast, you fast even when you don't want to. And what happens is, you still write a bunch of crappy poems or create a bunch of crappy stuff. However, you're still getting better by creating those crappy things. And then, when the lightning does strike, when the idea does come, you capitalize off of it even more. Because if you have a great idea after not creating for 2 weeks, versus having a great idea after creating crappy stuff for 2 weeks. You're going to capitalize better because you still were working that muscle. You know what I'm saying? And so, that is kind of the end of the official lecture part. But yeah, just in review, do not neglect the one thing that brings you the most life. Do not let all the other busyness of life cause you to push out the thing that keeps you grounded. That doesn't make any sense. There's nobody, when you see creativity as a discipline, you can never get too busy for something that keeps you healthy. The only thing you can do is undervalue it. You know, you're never too busy for prayer. You just don't value prayer enough to pray. Don't say you're too busy, because anything that you value enough, you make time for. That is always, always true. I remember I was in college and I was mad busy. I had a full workload and 2 part-time jobs, and I had 0 time. I was like, all my friends were like, dude, all you do is like go to work and study. And then I met this girl. Somehow, although I still had all those responsibilities, I wanted to date this girl, and suddenly I found hours out of my day to talk to her and to spend time with her. I don't even remember what I cut, but I cut something because I valued it enough. I valued her enough, right? And that's the same thing. You know, you're never too busy to create. You only have been convinced that your creativity isn't that valuable, but it is, and it's essential to be holistically healthy. Any questions in the last few minutes? Yep. Yeah, I try to create a lot, and even when I don't feel like it. So practically speaking right now, and it's not always like this, but like I'm not advertising this because I don't know if I'm going to fall off. But like 2018, I'm writing a poem a day the entire year. So it's not always a long 3-minute poem. Like it could be a tiny one, or sometimes it's just like a rap verse, like one verse or something. But like for me, I'm most known for spoken word, but one of my goals for 2019 is I want to put out a book of poetry, and writing for the page is very different than writing to perform. But so I knew I needed to hone my page game. I need to get better at it. I was like, the only way I'm going to get better at it is if I do it. So I was like, all right, 2018, I'm going to write a poem every day. That's what it looks like. It means waking up a half an hour early so that I could write before I came here. You know, it's a discipline. It sucks. It's hard at times. Some days I'm like, oh, dang, that was dope. But other days when I'm like, well, I have to travel. I got to go to the airport. I got a show, but I still have to write my poem. So what am I going to do? I'm going to discipline myself. And it hasn't always been that frequent. Sometimes I did just a poem a week, you know. But, yeah.
So, have you had a lot of like, late nights or sleepless nights while you're writing?
Me, no. And that's because I know my rhythms. So everyone is different. Some creatives are burning the midnight oil. My brain shuts off around 5:30, like creatively speaking. Like I cannot create at night. I just know that about myself. I went through college, never pulled an all-nighter, 4 years of college. I tried one time. It got about like 1 in the morning, and I'm literally typing gibberish into my computer. And I read it back, and I was like, that doesn't make any sense. And so I was like, I have to sleep. For me, I have to sleep. So I was more productive that night. I decided to go to bed, and even though I only slept for a few hours, I'm like, I'm going to go to bed and wake up at like 4:30 or 5. And even in those just 2 hours before class at 8, you know, writing from 5 to 8 or 6 to 8, I would get more done than if I tried to stay up all night. So I know I can't work late. So for me, my most productive hours are between 6 a.m. and 10 a.m. That is when I strike gold. I've just realized that about myself. So with this poem a day thing, almost every day I write it first thing in the morning. You know, if it's just not working, sometimes I'll do it later, but I seldom write at night. So you just got to find the rhythm for yourself. When it comes to that type of stuff, that stuff is different for everybody, you know. Like I also get very distracted. Because I observe everything so much, I cannot write in a coffee shop because I'm a people watcher, because I'm eavesdropping on the table next to me, because that frickin' someone ordered a frozen drink again, and I'm like, I can't think, you know? So I'm like, I only write at home, in my room, completely quiet. You know, if there's noise around my house, because my roommate be bumping music sometimes, then I use this website called rainymood.com, It's literally just the sound of rain falling, and it's white noise. I'll go to rainymood.com, put my headphones in, and write. So that's just me. I need quiet, and I need morning. So, any other questions? Yeah. See what affecting my life exactly?
Your creative discipline, the way you see it affecting your interaction with people,
Oh, absolutely. Absolutely. Again, when you're looking for it, as opposed to just letting life happen to you, I'm constantly looking for it. I've made that a rhythm of my life, like when I'm having a conversation with someone, when I'm looking for beauty, and that's just very different than when you're just kind of walking through, passing by, to actually have encounters as opposed to, oh yeah, nice to meet you, bye, see you later. You know what I'm saying? Like for me, some of the most impactful things have happened on really casual interactions. Like my first album is titled The Man Without a Name, my first album of poetry. And it was just about a homeless person I met. Now, we pass homeless people all the time. We either drop $1 in their hat or we act like we don't see him, whatever. And I went to talk to this homeless guy, and I said, hi, what's your name? And he goes, I don't have a name. I was like, oh. Again, I could have been like, all right, see you later, right? Like, dang, he clearly did not want to talk to me. Right? I was actually volunteering at this like homeless shelter, but he didn't want to talk. And I could have just been like, okay, that guy was mean or angry or rude or whatever, and just walked away. But I didn't. I couldn't get it out of my head. And so I went home. And what ended up happening was, so I tried to introduce myself to him. He says, I don't have a name. Don't talk to me. And I left. But we were serving dinner, and I was cleaning up. And he came up to me an hour later, after everyone was leaving and going to the chapel from the cafeteria, and he goes, hey, man, sorry for being so rude to you earlier. And then he just left. And again, it's one of those things where, like, it was an impactful interaction, but I could have just let it be. I could have been like, oh, yeah, no, it's all good, no worries. But I didn't. I went home, and I sat down, and I thought to myself, man, what has he been through? How has he been treated as a homeless person to where he has embraced this namelessness, this invisibility? Like, I was up here at first, my reaction was like, why is he so rude? But then I thought to myself, man, how many times had he been treated like he's just invisible to where he just expected people to ignore him, right? Like, I don't have a name. Why are you talking to me? So again, it's stuff like that where it's just like, it happens to everyone all the time. Most people just don't go home and reflect on it. And I don't always have time to do it in the moment, so I'll pull out my phone and write a note. And I'll do stuff like, met a homeless guy, told me he didn't have a name, boom. And then, the next morning I'll wake up and I'll just write about it. So just look for it. Write it down. Keep a pen and paper, a proverbial pen and paper in your pocket, if you're talking about writing. I mean, I don't know as much about other creative forms, but I would imagine it's pretty similar, You can let those moments escape you, or you can sit down and reflect on them, Here and then there, yeah. You had a question? Oh, okay, right here.
I was just wondering, you ever work collaboratively with other people?
Very seldom, but I do. Yeah, it's yeah, I mean, for me, it's just, I have a lot of issues. I mean, some of it is probably control issues and arrogance, but then some of it is, I feel like I exist in a very interesting space of a lot of, I'm not a fan of a lot of like the Christian art and Christian artists I meet, like not on a personal level, I just don't really dig their work. And so a lot of the same spaces that I'll be in with folks, I'm like, I would never talk about Jesus like that. I would never write a poem like that, or I would never want to. I have no problem. I'm glad that you're doing your thing and it resonates with some people, but I don't want anything to do with that, right? But then I hang out a lot in creative spaces that are not religious spaces at all. I go to a lot of open mics at bars and coffee shops, things like that, and I'm like, yo, awesome poems, like amazing people, cool. But then when it comes to like doing stuff together, collaborating or touring, it's like, I dig it, and I don't mind being there and even sharing a stage with you in certain spaces, but like we can't really like go on tour together, because if you was like here at Taylor's saying the stuff you said, I mean, I think it probably would be good for the students, but I'm sure a lot of people would not be happy, It's like, so it's kind of hard for me to figure out, well, I dig you, we could be friends, but we can't really collaborate, and so trying to navigate those spaces is kind of difficult. But I am open to it, and I think more than collaboration, being open to critique is very important. And I'm really open to that. Like whether or not I create with somebody, to find people that are not just going to stroke my ego, but respect what I do, actually like my art, and are not afraid of me, and not afraid to let me know when, nah, bruh, that was just all right. You think it's dope. It's not, and to be willing to receive that, I think is really important. So, yep. Uh-huh. Yeah. Sharing it more. Because for most artists I know, they simultaneously undervalue their art and overvalue it, right? They undervalue it, because we're all our own biggest critic. Oh, this sucks. But the reason they think it sucks is because they think they are better than they are, right? And they expect every time they pick up their pen that it's going to be brilliant. And that is ridiculous. Who do you think you are? What makes you think every piece of art you create is going to be amazing? That's just stupid. You're fine. You wrote a bad poem. You wrote 100 bad poems. Okay, who hasn't? Anybody who writes poetry has written 100 bad poems. You know what I'm saying? So it's like, I think is this arrogance, this expectation. We put too much pressure on ourselves to be more brilliant than we actually are. Or to be more brilliant than brilliant people who we respect, who write 100 bad poems all the time, right? So for me, one of the most helpful things is not to just on my own try to get a better perspective or accurately be like, okay, well, how good am I in relation to other poets? None of that is important. I think what's important is sharing your art and allowing people to interact with it. And I've found I've been both humbled and encouraged by that process. Pieces of poetry that I thought were, okay, end up like people being like, yo, that moved me so much. That really spoke to me. I'm like, oh man, okay. I have confidence now, like even if it's not the best poem in the world, like people, the things, the thoughts, the ideas I have resonate with someone, But also in the other way, like I could be up here thinking, yo, this is the bomb, and then I share it. I'm like, okay, the crowd didn't react quite as enthusiastically as I had hoped. Maybe I'm not as good as I thought I was, or at least in this picture. So I just think putting it out in space, and this is the thing. I love music. I love hip hop. But I think about it like this. Kendrick Lamar, I think he's one of the dopest rappers. I think he's definitely the dopest rapper alive right now. And still, anytime he releases an album, which again, usually 12 to 14 songs, 10 to 14 songs, I'll skip over half of them. Any genre, any music, artists that I love, that I think are dope, in an album that's 12 songs long, if I like 5 or 6, I say that's a great album. It's very rare that I really like 5 or 6 albums. So I'm up here like the professionals, like the dopest people at what they do, I'll put on their album and be like, yeah, there's 4 or 5 of them that I thought were amazing, and the rest were just, mediocre, and these 2 were really bad. So I'm like, if I'm up here critiquing the artists that I think are amazing and only liking about half of anything they put out, then why do I not afford or allow my own work to be like that? Why don't I just understand, hey, you know what? No matter what I make, some people are going to skip over it and be like, I only liked about half of them. Some people are going to be like, every single track was amazing. And some people are going to be like, this is garbage. Why would anybody listen to this? I have artists like that all the time that I'm just like, who likes this? And people are going crazy and they're selling out shows. Who cares? Who cares? It doesn't matter. That's not why we create. We don't create just so people will like it. We create because it's healthy for us. We create because we need it. We create because creating puts us in touch with God and our community, and someone needs to hear it. And whether or not I ever get famous for my music or poems, or I'm talking to a room of just a couple dozen people, right? I'm like, to me, I don't feel unsuccessful. You know, I did an event similar to this. It was a modest conference, and I did this poem about suicide. Oh, are we, what time?
Yeah, we're fine.
Okay. Oh, cool. What is, yeah, we're done, sorry. Where am I going?
There's a piano upstairs.
Okay, just come in, just interrupt me. I'm long-winded. I told you. I didn't know what was going on. All right, cool. All right, we're done. Come holler at my table.